wanted to start this off by saying that you were our first contributor who submitted something, and you were also the first person that we accepted. So thank you, first of all, for
That's lucky for both.
work. Absolutely. And I think I want to start off by asking what drew you to Archetype? Genuinely, like what did you think about when you thought about submitting to us?
I was going through a list on Twitter of journals that had just come out, and I've made it a rule since I first got started back in the 90s that I always submit to the first issues of journals.
Okay.
It's just something I believe in doing, and it has worked out for me.
That's fantastic. And what about the first issue of the journal? Why that rule?
Well, when I first got started, back when they were still mostly first issues were mimeographed and saddles stapled and cardstock covers, I found that those editors were much more receptive to the type of writing that I was doing back then. As I've advanced and gotten into bigger and bigger journals, I've stuck with the rule though, because it's just something that I believe in. It's the smaller journals, the newer journals that have helped me along in my career. So, now that I'm relatively successful, I like to go back and continue that and help them as well.
That's great. That's fantastic. We're super grateful that you submitted. Your poetry is fantastic to read, and I'm really glad that you're part of our first issue. So thank you. I'm hoping that we can talk a bit about your poems, if that's all right. I don't want to dive too deep into them because I like when people read poems and read stories for the first time without sort of a lot of context. I wanted to ask you first specifically about Hotel Room in Fairmont, West Virginia. Could you talk a bit about sort of your process for writing it and what inspired it?
When I got out of prison, I hadn't done a reading in probably, when I got out, probably 8 years. And then my second book came out, which was the book, The Prisoners, that I wrote in prison. And the journal Kestrel published some of my stuff after that and invited me up for reading. Kestrel's in Fairmont, West Virginia. And I've been up 2 or 3 times since then. And every time I always think about that first reading when I didn't know if I was going to be able to do it because it had been so long, but it was something I really loved to do. So when I got up on stage and just went with it and felt great about it afterwards, every time I would go back there, I would think about it again. So this was probably the second or third time that I went up there, and I had just finished another reading. I was in the hotel, just recovering from it, because as much as I love readings, they drain everything out of me. Yeah. And I was just lying there in the hotel bed trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to write about today? And all of it came back to me. The prisoner stuff, the first reading, just the good times and the bad, and it just all was sitting there with me when I wrote.
That's fantastic. It definitely comes through. It feels like you're dealing with a lot of emotional energy when you're reading the piece. I could tell when I was reading it that there was so much history coming into the present moment of you being in that hotel room that you're thinking about and contemplating, which was really beautiful to read. And you say you went to prison. Do you mind if I ask about your experience there, or what brought you there?
I was a drug addict for years, and I ended up robbing a couple of places. I was locked up for about 5 years.
In Hotel Room in Fairmont, West Virginia, the last stanza is what took my breath away. I thought it was such a beautiful way to end the poem. If you don't mind, I'm gonna read it very quickly. I'd look absurd in my Hawaiian shirt with pink and orange birds of paradise. You need the full poem to really appreciate that last line, but just the image of pink and orange birds of paradise. After all these things you're talking about, sort of this dingy hotel room, and then you just have this image of freedom and beauty. And I thought it was such a fantastic way to end the poem. So
well, thank you. I deal a lot with absurdity and the interplay between prison life and life outside on the road. Back before the pandemic, yeah. It was that struck me as absurd at the time. I'd spent all those years wearing khaki prison uniforms, and there I was in a Hawaiian shirt just hanging around.
Yeah, I'm curious. I don't know if you want to say anything more about absurdism, but how does it play a role in your writing? because I'm big on absurdism as a philosophy. So I'm just curious to get your take.
I try to find a laugh in everything. And the way my life has been, there has always been something to laugh about. I mean, I used to live in a house with a garage at a 90-degree angle. That's the example I like to give. But that's not a maneuver you want to make when you're coming home wasted at 2 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah.
But even in prison, if you pick up my book, The Prisoners, there was funny stuff that happened, and things that should be disturbing, but I was able to find the absurdity and the riff on that. Much of my writing is riffing on the interplay between serious things and sarcastic things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. I think that's really the only way we can get through life at times, because you have to laugh at how insane life can be. Like, we're just spinning on a ball of dirt. That's right. Absurd in itself. I'm hoping we can go back a bit and talk about your influences and what got you into writing, what got you into writing poetry specifically.
As far as what got me into writing, it was mostly anxiety, the same thing that got me into drugs. I've had lifelong social anxiety. I'm terrified of people. I mean, I fight it, but it's there. And those were the two things that most helped me to cope with it. So I started writing novels 89 or 90. And then just on the side, I would write poetry starting at about 90 or 91. And I never really considered myself a poet at the time. I always thought of myself as a novelist. And I think I wrote 15 novels in 15 or 16 years, but they weren't having any success. Whereas I kept writing the poetry and submitting it to journals, and my poetry was being published everywhere. So other people started telling me that I was a poet. And I fought it up until I went to prison in 2007. But once I got to prison and was basically starting over, I found that all I was writing was poetry at that point. I kind of accepted it then.
What is there any reason that you started writing poetry full stop that time? I
had gotten to the point where my novels were written almost entirely on drugs. So once I sobered up, it was not easy for me to pick that up again.
Yeah.
For some psychological reasons and some physical reasons. I think I mentioned it's hard for me to sit still for long.
Yeah.
The drug with that too. But and time is kind of sketchy in prison. So you've got a lot of time, but you're always up moving around, going, wandering the pod, playing card games, going to work in the afternoons. So you go home, go to your cell, and when you've got an hour, you just sit there and write. And you don't have time to work on a novel really. And the prison that I was in, they were mostly 6 and 8 man cells. So you've always got busyness going on around you.
Yeah.
I mean, I imagine it would be different if you were in isolation where you could focus on a novel, but I couldn't do that anymore. And so I just started writing poetry about everything that was happening, everything that I saw. And like I said, trying to find the laughter in it. And it worked out for me. I started probably about a year and a half in, I started sending it out to journals again and immediately had success with it. Really better success than I had going in. And I had a lot of publications when I went in. It was a bit of a surprise. I mean, so a moment of self-realization, I would say.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really great to hear. I want to ask you a question about your writing process. I know you just talked about what inspires you, but is there, in terms of form or structure, do you lean towards any type of poetry in particular? Do you have a way of starting your poetry, or is it sort of just come out of what you're thinking about?
Oh, I have many, many different ways to start.
Yeah.
The big one with me is I write, I call them question poems. For about 20 years now, I've collected questions from wherever I could get them, from things that I've been asked in conversation, from other poems, novels, from billboards, and even a cereal box once, just wherever I find them. And I write them down. And sometimes when I don't have anything else that I'm particularly thinking about, I'll reach in and just grab one of those questions and answer it. And that has been some of my favorite work and some of the stuff that I'm most known for.
That's fantastic. I think we're publishing one of those poems. What evidence do you find of your life?
Yeah, that's
one of the question poems, huh? That one's fantastic. I love that one.
Thank you. This is going to sound strange, but this is a process that's left over from my addiction days. It used to be that I would take the drugs and they would take about 20 minutes to kick in. So I would read for about 20 minutes while I was waiting for that. And then once that happened, then I would start to write. I still do that, just without the drugs. I will read for about 20 minutes, get my mind in that same sort of zone, and then I'll start to write. And it's almost like I'm channeling at that point. I'm in another place once I've actually been on the paper.
That's really interesting. Are you working on anything currently?
Oh yeah, I write a poem about every day. I work on short stories, probably 1 or 2 a month. In fact, I'm trying to find a publisher for a short story manuscript at the moment. Several short story manuscripts at the moment. I have more poems than I know what to do with.
We'll take them.
I may take you up on that.
We'll talk after this about issue 2. In terms of the poetry that you submitted for Archetype, is there anything that you're hoping people will take away from the pieces after reading them? Or are you just hoping that people enjoy them?
If they take anything away from them, I'm happy. People interpret my things in so many different ways. In fact, I wrote a poem recently about how differently people can interpret things. As long as they get something out of it, then I consider it a good exercise.
Yeah, absolutely. Is there anything else you want to add? Anything you want people to know?
Well, I have a lot of books available.
Where can people find them?
You can find all of them on Amazon, including a couple of those old novels that finally got published after I got out. I also, being an unemployed ex-con, writing poetry, any donations would be welcome. I have a Wix site. I think it's wixsite.com/Ace Boggess. I wouldn't swear to that though. You can Google me and find it. But I do take donations through the website, and they're always helpful.
Awesome. And we'll definitely link your website in the bio of whatever we're publishing this on, so people can find you and your work anytime.
Thank you.
Anytime. I really appreciate you chatting with me. Thank you so much.
All right. Excellent.
Awesome.